Every legal system has a final boss, right? That one ultimate rule that gives every other law its power. But what happens when that ultimate rule isn't actually written down anywhere? That's what we're looking into today. We're on a hunt for India's most powerful, and you could say, most mysterious legal idea. And our search kicks off with a really big question.
I mean, really think about it. Why does a law work? A cop can arrest someone because a law says so. Okay, but that law is only valid because it was passed by a legislature, which was created by the Constitution. So what gives the Constitution its authority? You see the pattern? Where does that chain of because finally stop? That is the absolute core of what we're digging into.
All right, to help us on this mission, we're going to borrow a tool from a famous legal thinker, Hans Kelsen. He had a name for this ultimate foundational rule, the Grundnorm, which basically just means the basic norm. The best way to think of it is as the one rule that doesn't need another rule to prove it's valid. It's the original source of everything. And our job today? To find India's Grundnorm. So, where do we start looking? Well, our first and most obvious suspect has to be the Constitution of India itself. I mean, it seems like a total slam dunk, right? It's the supreme law of the land. Let's take a look at the evidence for why it seems so obvious. And yeah, the case for the Constitution is really, really strong. It sits right at the very top of the legal pyramid. Every single law, from the huge Indian Penal Code all the way down to a local traffic rule, has to line up with it. If any law steps out of line and contradicts the Constitution, boom, it's declared void. This looks exactly like what Kelsen was talking about. So, case closed, right? Well, not so fast. Yeah, just when we thought we had this all figured out, we hit a major plot twist. It turns out our prime suspect, the Constitution, might have an alibi. It seems it doesn't quite fit the very specific description of a true Grundnorm. Okay, so the case against the Constitution really boils down to two big problems. First, Kelsen was pretty clear that a Grundnorm has to be unchangeable. It's the foundation. But Article 368 of the Indian Constitution literally gives Parliament the power to amend it. So strike one. Second, a Grundnorm is supposed to be the ultimate source with nothing behind it. But the Indian Constitution didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's built on these deep, pre-existing ideas of justice, liberty, and equality. It has a source. And that means our search for the real Grundnorm is definitely not over. So that brings us right back to square one, doesn't it? If the Constitution, the supreme written law of the land, isn't the final authority, then what in the world is? We've got to dig deeper. We need to find something even more fundamental. And this is where we meet the real hero of our story. It's not some article or clause written down in a book. It's an idea, a really powerful doctrine created by the courts themselves. It's called the Basic Structure Doctrine. So what exactly is this doctrine? Put simply, it's like a line in the sand drawn by the judiciary. The Supreme Court basically said, look, Parliament, you can amend the Constitution, but you can't destroy its core identity. There are certain fundamental features, the very soul of the document, that are completely off limits. And you can think of these features as the unshakable pillars holding up the entire system. We're talking about big stuff, like the supremacy of the Constitution itself, India's secular and democratic nature, the separation of powers between different branches of government, judicial review, and, of course, fundamental rights. See, these are just legal rules you can tweak. They're considered the very identity of the Indian Constitution, and they can't just be erased. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, where is this written down in the Constitution? And you'd be right to ask, because it isn't. The court's argument for it is based on something called the doctrine of implied limitations. The idea is that some things are just so obvious, so fundamental, that they don't need to be explicitly spelled out. But, and this is a big but, that's also where all the controversy comes from. Critics argue that having an unwritten rule interpreted by judges gives the judiciary a huge amount of power over the parliament that people actually voted for. And this whole thing wasn't just some philosophical debate in a classroom. Oh no, this doctrine was forged in the fire of some of the biggest legal battles in India's history. Let's look at a few landmark cases that show how it really came to life and flexed its muscles. So you can really see the doctrine's power grow over time. It all kicks off in 1973 with the huge Keshavananda Bharathi case. That's where the idea is first introduced. Then, just 2 years later, in 75, the court uses it to say that free and fair elections are a basic feature and can't be touched. And then, by 1997, it goes a step further and declares that its own power of judicial review is also part of the basic structure. You can see this doctrine definitely has some real teeth. Okay, so why have we gone down this entire legal rabbit hole? Well, because this isn't just some abstract puzzle for lawyers to argue about. You can make a very strong case that the basic structure doctrine is the ultimate guardian of Indian democracy. This is really where you see how it all fits together. You have the rule of law, which says nobody is above the law. That's supported by constitutionalism, which is the idea that the government's power is limited by the Constitution. But here's the key question. What stops a powerful government from just changing the Constitution to give itself more power? That is where the basic structure doctrine comes in. It's the ultimate failsafe. It's the bedrock that says, nope, you have to play by the core rules no matter what. And this is what makes the Constitution a true living document. It means it can adapt, it can be amended to face new challenges. But the basic structure doctrine acts like an anchor. It makes sure that even as the Constitution evolves, it never loses its fundamental character, its soul.
And there's actually another layer that reinforces all of this, something called constitutional morality. This is a really fascinating idea. It says that just because something is popular, that doesn't automatically make it a good law. Any law also has to align with the deep moral values that are baked into the Constitution. Values like equality and human dignity. It's about following the spirit of the law, not just the black and white text.
So it seems we found our Grundnorm. It isn't a single written text after all. It's a living, breathing set of principles, and they're guarded by the judiciary. And that leads us to one final really big question. If a nation's ultimate law is unwritten and it's defined by judges, then who guards the guardians? That's a question that really gets to the very heart of how a modern democracy works.